Okay, so we're back again. My brother and I were here to talk about more logical fallacies. You know, there's almost one created every day, it seems lately. Every time I think that we've exhausted means to think sillily or foolishly, we come up with new ways to do it. So I guess it's proof positive of man's depraved nature. Uh, so, but before we start getting into some of this, like I think a natural thing is like, are we just airing our opinions? You know, are we just rational beings, being Christians that are just mean spirited and looking for things to criticize? The thing is, there is biblical precedent where we are, as Christians, supposed to criticize ideas. And so one of the passages we can point to is found in 2 Corinthians 10. And it says this, I, Paul, this is verse 1, myself entreat you by the meekness and gentleness of Christ, I who am humble when face to face with you, but bold towards you when I am away. I beg of you that when I am present, I may not have to show boldness with such confidence as I count on showing against some who suspect us of walking according to the flesh. For though we walk in the flesh, we are not waging war according to the flesh. For the weapons of our warfare are not of flesh, but have divine power to destroy strongholds. We destroy arguments and every lofty opinion raised against the knowledge of God, and take every thought captive to obey Christ, being ready to punish every disobedience when your obedience is complete. So I think in this passage, Paul's saying, like, look, we're in war. We're in a war. There's a lot of Christians that don't like the language of war, but Paul, it's a very common biblical metaphor that's used, like we're at a war. But what Paul says is the kind of war that we're facing is not a fleshy war. It's not one that has to do with being embodied in this sense. We are talking about a spiritual war that often takes place in the realm of ideas. And so he goes on to explain, like, that's why we destroy every stronghold in argument that raises itself up against Christ, is because we need to tear those things down. That's the kind of things that we have to destroy, because that's where people are retreating to avoid Christ. So I don't know. It's not the most extended exposition of that text, but any thoughts on that text, brother?
No, I've made that basically kind of a life mission as one who teaches young people classes like apologetics and in doctrine. And one of the points that I make out to them too is it mentions strongholds and it mentions arguments or lofty opinions. It's not mentioning people. So when we're going after these arguments, we're not attacking the person, because that would actually be a logical fallacy. I actually think there's kind of an implied avoidance of a fallacy there. You're not attacking people. You're not attacking somebody's heritage. You're attacking the arguments. And the reason is not because you want to be right. The reason you're doing this is because you want everybody to come to the knowledge of the truth. You want people to be Christians. And when it comes to these ideas, these lofty opinions, notice we don't baptize them. We don't play with them. We don't dance with them. We don't sort of use them as analytical tools. We demolish them.
Yeah.
And so that doesn't, again, that's not out of maliciousness. It's not because we think we're better than everybody else. I think you and I both agree with the statement, but for the grace of God, go I.
Yeah.
It's not like we're immune from fallacious reasoning. We're all fallen human beings. But because of the eyes of faith, and because we think that every thought should be captive to that Christian worldview, says that in that passage also, if that's true, then we go after these things for the sake of love. If we love our neighbors, and if we truly love our neighbors, we don't let people reason wrongly or avoid the truth of Christianity just because they have bad reasoning. If we love our neighbors, we demolish those strongholds. So it's not only commanded in Scripture, it's also an act of love and care for our neighbors. If we didn't do this, then we'd be hating our neighbors. So it's kind of this misunderstanding that people have that Christianity, as we were discussing earlier, is you must be nice. That the 11th commandment, you must be nice and forget the other 10. And so this passage kind of is a good counteraction to that.
Well, and I think Paul, he starts out, it's like, man, when I'm in person, I would rather be meek and gentle and humble with you. But there's times where I have to take up my pen and write boldly to you because of some of this false argumentation, these strongholds that are opposing Christ. I have to oppose those very strongly. Let me give you an example of this. This a few years ago in Sterling, where I live, we had a cult that came by and would accost church members and myself in different stores. And so we would at times have to just tell them, you guys need to stop, like very strongly, like this. No, I hope you fail. We are praying that God will judge you and stop what you're doing. Now,
Yeah.
I mean, there was nothing else. Like, we weren't going to convince them, and they're going around accosting our church members. And that's where, as a shepherd, as a pastor, my role is to protect the sheep. And if I have a wolf, which is what this cult was, this is a wolf, I'm going to tell that wolf, you need to shut your mouth and go away.
Another great example of that is a lot of the prosperity gospel preachers. I call them out by name sometimes. I'll call them one out right now, like Kenneth Copeland.
Yeah.
If you're listening to Kenneth Copeland, that is a false teacher. He's a liar, and he's under influence of dark forces or whatever you want to say. I don't care. He is a bad teacher. He is teaching false doctrine, and he's worth $750 million because people have bought his false teaching, and it's a false gospel. He thinks that he wants, I mean, I'm not thinking millionaire thoughts. I don't need a millionaire flow. I need a billionaire flow. I mean, it's all about money. And, you know, he claims to have the authority over COVID and over weather and all these other different things. That's false doctrine. And we call that out because he's misleading people. Now, do we want Kenneth Copeland to repent and come to the knowledge of the truth? Absolutely. Do we want him to use that $750 million wealth for the cause of the true gospel? Absolutely. But until he does so, we are going to point out that it's a false gospel. And that's an act of love, not just towards him, but towards all the people who are deluded and influenced by him, and even people outside the church. So there's a precedent for that also. And it's all throughout Paul. I firmly believe that the two epistles to the Corinthians, we need to be studying those more often, because the American church is more like the church in Corinth. It is messed up. Yeah. I mean, there's all right. There's sexual sins, there's discipline issues, there's confusion on how we practice Holy Communion. I mean, there's a whole list of things in those two books. I think the American church could use a good heavy dose of really exegeting and studying those two epistles from Paul to the church in Corinth.
Yeah, and this ties into one of the things we were talking about before we hit start, is like, whenever we have these conversations about arguments and about things that we believe are false or contrary to God's word, scripture, and everything else, one of the things that you run into, at least I have, is what we were calling the tone police. You didn't say that nice enough. You know, you weren't quite kind in how you put that. And because of that, you know, you're supposed to speak the truth in love, right? And that's probably their favorite verse, is to quote, to quote that. I think it's First Peter, speaking the truth. Or no, it's Paul, speaking the truth in love.
Right. First Peter 3:15 is similar with do it always with gentleness and respect, right?
Right. Yeah. So that's their favorite thing. It's like, you need to always make it sweet. It's gotta just sound. You gotta make it sound really, really nice. Well, in context, what that's going, like, yeah, you can be forceful. It's basically saying don't be a jerk. In my mind, that's where you're speaking the truth in love. It doesn't mean you got to sugarcoat it and try to make it go down easier. It's like, you don't got to go like, you're a stinking idiot and stop thinking these things. I mean, I don't start name calling it. To me, it means don't be a jerk. That's what the scripture is saying. Don't be a jerk when you're trying to call these things out. But it's not saying don't make your point forcefully and be so nice about it and soft. And I don't think that's what those passages are talking about.
No, I don't either. And I think the culture has decided that niceness and kindness are equivalent terms to love, right? They can be, but there is such a thing as truthful love or tough love. Or, I mean, any parent can tell you there is, or a teacher can tell you there is such a thing as tough love. It doesn't mean you're not loving your students when you discipline them. It doesn't mean you're not loving your students when you put them in a seating chart. It doesn't mean you're not loving your kids when you tell them that they've lost their treats or that they have to go to their room or they've been grounded. That's not unloving to do those things. And so somehow we've equated niceness or kindness in all circumstances, even in the words we choose and the tones we use, that all of a sudden that means that. I mean, what am I supposed to do with my child or my students? Am I supposed to go, oh, you're being so bad right now, so I'm just going to have to create a seating chart? Really? Is that love? I mean, just like, no, be quiet or you're going to have a consequence. It doesn't mean I don't love them. They need to know the gravity of the situation.
I mean, this is an extreme example just to make the point. Like, if I have a heroin addict, I'm not going to go, I realize that your life is really hard and that you're going through some dark times with your emotions and you need some coping mechanisms. So, I understand why you are resorting to drug use, and, you really shouldn't be using that heroin, but, I can understand your life's pretty rough right now. And it's, it's not something that you should be indulging in. I mean, I could say that would be kind of what the new, what I'm calling the tone police are saying I should say about truth things, or I can just say heroin is destroying your life. You need to stop.
Right. And it depends. And of course, nobody questions that there's, depending on your relationship with that individual, you should adapt, right? I mean, nobody's saying that we need to say the exact same line for every single person. We all agree that we should have relationships with people. We all agree that people should know that you care about them in multiple ways, not just lifestyle ways or the certain problems things. And so that's nobody's questioning that. But for some reason, there's this assumption, as you're kind of alluding to, that if you say something firm, you therefore are either violating some sort of Christian principle, or that you aren't loving that person enough, or you don't have a good enough relationship. And my point is if people know that you care about them and that your goals are not self-serving, that you can be firm with somebody because you're actually telling them the truth. I'd much rather have somebody tell me the truth and be a little mad about it and a little hurt and then realize they were right, than to have them tell me a bunch of fluffy stuff and then I'm like, wait, did he think what I'm doing is wrong or not? Yeah. Right? I mean, there's a difference between those. I'd rather have hurt feelings and be confronted with something true than to be really, really happy and not really know what they're standing on. I mean,
yeah. And with them is the nuanced police who think that if you say something, you got to say everything that there is to say about it. And
first, yes.
Yeah.
Before you say what you think. Yes.
And so by the time you've properly nuanced everything, everybody's kind of going, so what was your point? It's like, cause it's like, you got to say everything that there is to say about a particular issue. You can't ever get to that. Black Lives Matter might be one, to use a slogan, like, unless you can, properly nuance and say everything that there is to say about that organization or the motto or whatever it is, unless you give all the nuance about it, then you can't make any statement regarding it. It's like, I mean, there's all sorts of things that you might say, that you might point out on that. Yeah.
Right. And it's not that nuance never exists. I mean, when you study history, for example, or when you're studying demographics, or when you're studying politics, sure, everybody admits that sometimes simplistic statements or jingoistic statements don't necessarily cover all your bases. But that doesn't mean you have to always have a 15-minute statement just to say a truth claim, for example. Right. Well, so that's the issue and the reason I think we do this is we've bought in this idea, or bought is not a word, we've purchased this idea, or we've bought into this idea that in order to have an opinion, or in order to engage in the marketplace of ideas, you have to like butter everybody up first in order to actually be in the marketplace of ideas. And I'm not convinced that that's healthy, because then nobody really knows anything. And we're just all nice. And isn't it great that we're having a discourse, or we're having a dialogue? That's why we like terms like that. We like words like dialogue and discourse. We don't like words like conclusion or resolution. We just want to talk for the sake of talking.
Right. Like, for example, because I might offend somebody, they wouldn't be happy if I said something like Christians shouldn't watch the Game of Thrones because it's pornographic.
Right.
And which to me is pretty clear that I actually have never watched it. And that's why I haven't watched it, because I don't want to put that kind of junk in my head. But from what I've heard and the reviews that I've read on Game of Thrones, that's what it sounds like it is. So I can pretty much, I think, with pretty good certainty say that, but they're like, well, you should probably say it a little nicer, give it a little nuance. People might really like the story. It's like,
or the way they portray it isn't necessarily pornographic. They're trying to show how people are being exploited. And so it's not inherently lurid, or I know exactly what you mean. That's how it goes. Another great example. I mean, the same thing is with music and with artwork and other things. You look and then you point out Paul, whatever's pure, whatever's holy, whatever's true, whatever's praiseworthy, when he makes a list like that. Or when Job says, I made a covenant with my eyes. I mean, we can go all through those different things, right? All those different scripture passages where it's pretty clear you'd have a hard time justifying some of those things. But if you say that, you're right. It's not nuanced enough for, well, as long as your discernment level is high, or as long as you do those things, like if the Apostle Paul is sitting next to you, right next to you right now, would you be able to watch it with him?
Yeah.
If you say no, what makes it okay to watch it without it?
Or would you watch it with, there's the little bit facetious side of me. Could I watch it with my grandma?
Right. I mean, that's another way of saying that. Right. Would you? Yeah. Unfortunately, now you can't. I mean, it used to be you could say that.
You used to be able to say that.
now it's a little bit less common to actually be able to say that. So, with all those caveats in which we just expressed all our nuance and why we're doing this, ironically, I guess, let's go into some of our fallacies. So, what's our first one?
Yeah. So the first one that we're going to look at, I'll go ahead and grab this one. It's called false causation, and false causation basically boils down to this slogan: correlation and causation. And so because the false cause sees a correlation, and from that correlation determines causation. So for example, I might observe every time I have an umbrella, it's raining. Therefore, my umbrella causes rain. and so that's how this works. I mean, that's kind of a silly example. Let's give a little more serious one. So one of the things that I could skip a couple meals and go, you know what causes me to be hungry is me skipping meals. Well, if you actually get into the biology of it, it's more complex than me skipping meals of why I'm hungry, right? Because I have energy expenditure, and I need to replenish the calories that my body has burned throughout the course of the day. That's what makes me hungry, not me not eating meals. Right. So, sometimes causation can be more complicated. There's more into it than just a simple matter of these two things seem related, and because they seem related, one causes the other. Right. So one example that comes up in this that gets thrown around in America right now is this idea of disparate incomes for men and women. And so somebody goes, we have the gender pay gap, and all this stuff. And they're like, okay, men are paid this, women are paid this, therefore there's gender discrimination. It must be because of this inequality of income, must be because of some gender discrimination. Well, when you start looking at it, there's more into it. There's more that goes into this than that. Number one, what kind of jobs do the women and men have? Maybe men are choosing jobs that pay more and women are choosing jobs that pay less. For example, men choose on average to be engineers and into technology, whereas women on average are going to choose professions like teaching or childcare, which tend not to pay as much. And so it doesn't mean that that's not a valuable thing, but in terms of the economy of the US, so those different jobs have different incomes. So that's just one example for why there might be a reason for that gender disparity. Any thoughts you have on that?
Well, based on just that one on itself, there's some other issues we could bring into this just to kind of buttress the point that you're making. Men tend to choose more dangerous jobs on a whole. In the aggregate, which means that they're going to be paid more because the risk is higher. Men are more likely to work long and strange hours than women are because women tend to be more family oriented. Men tend to not take time off when they have a family. And there's a whole list. And again, I'm not saying there's not exceptions to the rule, but when you do that in a nation of 330 million people and you aggregate all that together, most of the income gap disappears. My side argument for this, and this is an interesting one, is if you can pay women less than you can pay men, why wouldn't you hire all women and save money?
Yeah.
So, obviously something else is going on because, if you want to just make money, if your goal is to make money as a CEO or as a business owner or as a manager, if you can pay women, however many cents on the dollar less, you would do so because then you're going to make more money, but nobody does that. So obviously there's other things that are at play and there's more factors that go into this. It's not direct. The other example I was going to bring into this, and I think you know this as well, this happens a lot in what people call critical theories, whether it's critical feminist theory, critical race theory, critical any of these theories, is you find a group, you find a victim group, whether it's women or people of color or whatever your term is, or the LGBTQ community, you can just put whatever you want in there. And then what you do is you identify that group and then you assess group outcomes. And so you assume that this group is already oppressed to start with. So you're already making an assumption. Maybe it's true, but it is an assumption. And then what you do is you say, okay, now let's measure it against a group that we think is an oppressor or more powerful. And so we look at things like people who own their houses or income inequality or prison sentencing or whatever it is. You can throw a whole bunch of different things in there. And when you see that disparity, you assume, therefore, that something is going on there that's inherently discriminatory because there's, you know what I'm saying? So it shows up in there. And we were talking before, there's some begging the question that's related to this as well. And that you assume that there's discrimination or you assume that the gap exists. And so therefore this is true. And so they're kind of related things. But that's kind of my take on that, is I think you're right about the income gap one. That's a really famous example. But I think anytime you see a disparity, we assume discrimination or there's some sort of correlation and causation issue that's going on. I would point to people, and I think you would agree with me, but Thomas Sowell's work, Discrimination and Disparities, is excellent on this. And then he also goes out and points out a bunch of other disparities that nobody ever talks about, which is kind of cool. So I would recommend that for people who want to learn more about that and why a lot of the simplicity that comes in that is just simply false, or it's used to serve a broader narrative, like the narratives of critical theory, for example.
I think transgenderism is another one. Transgender suicide rates is another one. Like, because transgenders on average, people who identify as transgendered on average commit suicide more often, that must be because people are picking on them. That's basically what they say, and are not affirming their lifestyle choice. That's the assumption. And because the non-affirmation of the lifestyle choice, they are more apt to commit suicide. Or could it be that that's a mental disorder and they have other mental disorders, and they are more likely, because that didn't resolve the issue, whatever that issue was, and that might be why they are committing suicide on average more. So it's that single factor analysis that this false causation seems to play into lots of cultural issues. And those are just a couple that have come to my mind, that it seems like we make those sorts of mistakes as a culture right now fairly often.
Right, we do. I agree completely. So I think that's one issue, and like we said, there's other fallacious reasoning that's attached to it. But yeah, that's a great example, because gender dysphoria is in the DSM, the diagnostic manual, right? It's in the DSM as a diagnosable psychological issue. And so when somebody is struggling with mental health, just because they can't meet into a certain societal norm as it's perceived or something, doesn't mean that that's the cause. It could be that, like you're saying, there's underlying, whether it's psychological or hormonal or chemical issues that are also going on that could be at play. But we're not allowed to look at that, because the narrative is subject A is the oppressor, subject B is the oppressed. We assume that going in. This is where that begging the question thing is coming in a little bit. And therefore we have a single cause, and the single cause is they're not being recognized, so therefore they have a higher rate of suicide or a higher rate of self-harm or whatever it is. No, you're absolutely correct. That's exactly what happens.
So, Aaron, let me ask you a question. This is going to be our transition to our next one here. Aaron, are you transphobic?
I don't believe so. I don't have any reason to be.
Well, I mean, I don't see you affirming them, so that must mean that you're transphobic. So how would you know that you're not? Because it seems like if you were in full support of trans people, you would be, you would be affirming that sometimes you can be transphobic. So by your very denial, you are proving that you are transphobic.
Well, see, by denying that, I don't have nothing to do with this, because personally, I'm not on the internet that much. I'm not tweeting that much. I'm really just there for families. So I'm not sure how that's relevant to this.
Yeah. So welcome to the Kafka trap.
Yeah, welcome to the Kafka trap. We keep going, and I do this with my students, and I want to introduce this one. This one's a great one. This comes from an author named Frank Kafka. And if you've not read Frank Kafka before, I don't love everything he wrote. Not everything's written from what we would call the Christian worldview. He's writing in like the 1920s and 30s. So this is during the time with the rise of fascism and the rise of communism and a lot of those isms, international socialism and all that. And he writes this book. It's a small story called The Trial. And this man wakes up in the trial, and he's given these really vague charges. And in these vague charges, he doesn't really know how to respond, because he's given this. And every time he tries to give contrary evidence or try to give an alibi, it's used as further evidence of his guilt. So it would be like, well, no, I wasn't there yesterday. I was with my parents. Well, only somebody guilty would come up with an alibi like that. It's clearly the reason you're trying to come up with excuses is because you're already guilty. And since you're already guilty, we assume that. So why do you keep denying it? In fact, by denying it, you're proving to us that you feel guilty. And so therefore you're just not recognizing the level of your guilt. And so it goes on and on. This is called The Trial, Frank Kafka. You can look this up. And Kafkaesque is even a word that some literature professors or even philosophers will use about dystopias, these kind of future ways. And I would argue we're already in that dystopia, where everybody's going on their 9-to-5 job, and everybody's just kind of just going through the motions, and everybody just kind of gets a number in the society. So it's a criticism of kind of like the managerial state. But then also in the judicial system, you just go along with it, because if you don't go along with it, it's further proof of your guilt. So you might as well just kind of take your punishment or take what you get, because it's better than getting even something worse by trying to fight it. And so we all recognize that. And so my point is, with the Kafka trapping, the most common example of this that you see, and it's even used in the church, unfortunately, is Robin DiAngelo's book, White Fragility. And if you have not read White Fragility, or if you have had it, I guarantee you, if you haven't read it, you've heard of it, or at least heard of the ideas, because this is used in corporate training sessions, and it's even used in churches. But it basically does exactly that. It says that you are already guilty of an oppressive system. If you are white, cisgendered, male, et cetera, right? You're part of the hegemon, whatever you want to call it. You're the man. You are already a beneficiary of the system. And so when you say, well, no, I'm not racist, or no, I have these friends, and I've even, marched in a parade, or I've learned, because I'm a Christian, that everybody's created as one blood, all nations among men, like the book of Acts says. I'm supposed to love my neighbor. No, doesn't matter. Because you are a beneficiary of that system. you are already guilty. And so when you give me contrary evidence, what that really is your fragility, hence white fragility. You're fragile, you're uncomfortable with these things, and you're seeking equilibrium. And so that's why you're in denial. That's why you're trying to give contrary evidence. That's why you're trying to tell your story. Nope, that story doesn't matter. You're already guilty. And so you just need to be enlightened or come to an awareness of how guilty you are. So then when you're aware of that, you can do the political program, do the work of anti-racism or whatever it is. And so white fragility and white equilibrium and all these terms that are being thrown around, like people know what they mean when they really don't, is a ginormous, and I'm using a colloquialism, ginormous, but it's a huge Kafka trap. It's a logical fallacy. Go ahead and add on, brother.
No, I think that's probably the one that I see most often is in racial matters right now. It seems like that's where the Kafka trap has gone on the most. I was trying to think of more of I was trying to think if there's a theological one that I've encountered with this as well.
Well, it is theological because it's used in the church.
Yeah, right? I guess I was just thinking like a theological argument, like Calvinism, Arminianism, or something like that.
Where right. Okay, let's say because Robin DiAngelo's book is used in some churches.
Yes, it is. And it was the basis of some curriculum that's been put out there. I would say this in terms of the Black Lives Matter, because you won't say Black Lives Matter or hashtag it on your, because as if that actually proves that you're supporting. Never mind that. But
that's
anyway,
what makes you an activist, right?
Yeah. But because you don't say it or you don't hashtag it, it means that you are non-supportive of African American value, and it's like, no, I can't. I don't tweet or put any of that on my social media or say that phrase because the organization associated with that phrase I cannot support for a bunch of various reasons. So to avoid confusion, I don't even talk about, I don't even use that phrase. It's not that I don't agree with the what you would say the statement or the proposition, Black Lives Matter.
Sentiment. Right. Yeah.
If we called it a proposition, of course. But if it's not, but in our culture, in our moment, it means not just the proposition, but the organization. That's often affiliated with
the assumptions of critical theory, that you assume that there is this kind of oppressed class and an oppressor class, and that there's a certain secret knowledge that certain people have that you just need to elevate those stories and you just take them at face value. You don't need to ask for evidence. If you ask for evidence, that's proof you're in a position of privilege. You have to. So even though it's just a hashtag, there's a lot of assumptions about the organization or the movement that comes about this, or the way it's portrayed in the media, or what the activists say it is. And so when you say it, we create confusion. I'm with you.
Yeah. And so for us, and for me, you'll probably never see that on anything I post unless I'm posting something to be critical of it.
Right. Or to actually explain why. Right. Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah. But anyway, but if you don't do that, the assumption is you must be racist.
Right.
And so, or you're not. And it's so weird. It's like you cannot win with this particular theory, especially if you're white. So I can be.
No, that's the exact right. That's the exact point. That's why it's a Kafka trap. You cannot win. The guilt has already been predetermined. And since the guilt has already been predetermined, if you struggle against that or you refuse to admit it, you're showing your fragility. You're showing your guilt. That's where it's the Kafka trap. Because if you're trying to give contrary evidence, it's only because you're uncomfortable. It's because you're seeking equilibrium. It's because you're fragile. It's because it makes you uncomfortable. And since you're a beneficiary of it by being silent, your silence is violence. I don't know if you've ever heard that before.
Yeah. Silence is violence. Yep.
Or silence is consent, or whatever it is. And you can go along. It's like, no, it's because there's more options here, or because the organization itself is flawed, as you've said. That's a huge problem that we're running into. I love, I believe it's Vodi Bakum points this out, but Abraham X. Kendi in his book, that's the cousin book. If you haven't read Right Fragility, the other one that you will read is Abraham X. Kendi's, which is How to Be an Anti-Racist, or there's a children's curriculum that goes with it that goes all the way back. It's like called Anti-Racist Baby. So they're going all the way to when you're like, 2 years old with storybooks. Okay, but Abraham X. Kendi is another person that advocates these sort of things. So you got Robin DiAngelo, Abraham X. Kendi. If you don't know those two, those are the two people. But he basically says, this is again to prove that you're guilty. So if you're not, there's no such thing as not racist. It doesn't exist. You are either part of the racist system or you are anti-racist. Not racist is actually racist in his position, right? And so that's a huge confusion, and that's where the guilt is assumed in order to quote unquote do the work of anti-racism, you have to assume your guilt in the first place. So you have logical fallacies on top of logical fallacies, and that's somehow supposed to create a utopia in society. And the answer, the real answer is, and I think you know this too, is what this really is it's a form of an anti-culture.
Yeah.
It's not so much of a culture, it's just to try to blow things up. It's to try to destroy society or try to recreate society. You just keep, this work is never done until the revolution happens. It has nothing to do with logic. It has nothing to do with evidence. It has nothing to do with truth. It has everything to do with destruction.
Yeah. So probably need to touch on our last one that we were talking about, which are various appeals to the people.
Yeah. And this is often thrown in there with it. It could be
appeal to the people is appealing to some group or subgroup in order to affirm either whether or not it's right or whether or not it's wrong or whatever it happens to be. So the most common one is the bandwagon one. We learned this one when we were teenagers. Hey, mom and dad, all my friends have a MP3 player, so I should have one too.
Right. Today it's the latest iPhone, right? It's the same principle. Yep. iPhone. Yeah. What are we on now? 10, 11? What are we on now? I don't even remember.
Yeah. And all parents watching this know the response, and us as kids know this response. If all your friends were jumping off a cliff, would you jump off a cliff too? Just to prove how dumb of an argument it is.
Right.
But bandwagon appeals, though, happen all the time. Like polls are like, okay, should I even care as a Christian what the polls say about whether or not Americans support abortion or not? I don't really care. It's wrong. I don't care if it's 60-40, 70-30, 80-20, 90-10. I don't care what the percentage is. Abortion's just wrong. And it's like, for whatever reason, like there's this weird fascination we have with polling numbers as if to prove our own opinions.
Yeah, I think what happens is it's fallacious, but I think the reason is related to this. The appeal to the people is the people are assumed to be democracy, because that's what democracy means, right? It's ruled by the people. It literally means people power, right?
Yeah.
And so because we are a quote unquote in a democracy, which of course I question anyways, we're a constitutional republic, not a pure democracy, but there's this kind of worship of democracy. So if the majority of the people want it, it's therefore good, because we know beforehand that democracy is inherently virtuous, and you can't have any other form of government but democracy. Otherwise, it's authoritarian or it's not enlightened enough or whatever it is. And so we have this democratic assumption that it's the greatest, most perfect form of government ever known to man. And so if the people want something as moral, or the people think it's a good idea, you better give it to them, because that's democracy, and we know democracy is good. And so it's an appeal to the people kind of mixed in with this democratic idealism. And that creates this issue. So if the majority of Americans, like you said, the abortion is a great example, want Roe v. Wade to be upheld, well, then we better uphold it, because that's what the majority of Americans want. Truth and morality is not determined by a vote. I mean, there's really extreme examples of this, but go in the American South in the 1920s on racial issues, since we wanted to have racial issues. Poll the people of Alabama in 1920 about whether or not African Americans should be voting. I mean, honestly, does that mean it's right because the majority decided it? In 2011, when the Arab Spring took place, and in Egypt, the people elected the Muslim Brotherhood, which is an extreme organization. That's who they elected. They freely, democratically elected the Muslim Brotherhood. Well, then it must be good then. So it's a really silly argument, but people are doing that because they want to be in the majority. And one of my lines, and I say this to my students, and I think you'll appreciate this, is I'll tell people, I'd rather be in the minority and right than in the majority and liked.
Yeah.
And I will say that over and over and over again. I'd rather be the minority and right than in the majority and liked. And unfortunately, you're because we think majority equals truth, or majority equals right, or majority equals good. Therefore, if you're on the wrong side of history, like you mentioned earlier, and other things, therefore you're wrong. That's more chronological, but it's the same sort of argument. And so I'll let you go ahead and pick up there.
Yeah, no, I mean, the wrong side of history is, I think, a version of the bandwagon, which is just like, our culture is moving in this direction to embrace this particular position. So don't you want to jump on this train too and be on the right side of history? So to me, it's a kind of bandwagon, that whole being on the right side of history sort of appeal. Number one is, how in the world are you going to know whether or not you're on the right side of history or not? I can just see, like, 500 years from now, our great grandchildren going, what in the world were you doing back then?
Yep.
As if that anyway, as if history itself determines the rightness or wrongness of his position anyway. But
But you're right, it is bandwagon because you assume that with history progressing the way it's progressing, that the majority of people have accepted it or will accept it or come to accept it. So therefore, it's inherently morally true, and you need to get the right side of history. Otherwise, you should be shunned or you should be silenced or canceled or whatever word you want to use. So no, that's absolutely part of this appeal to the people thing. Politicians do it, theologians do it. So now let's go to theology. If you want to do this theologically, let's go to the Bible. Well, it's the year 2022, and those people back then, they were Christians and they meant well, but they had a first century mindset. They were a pre-industrial, iron or bronze age people. And so now that it's the year 2022 and we're enlightened and we've had, the scientific revolution and all these advances, we don't need those things anymore. I mean, it's still God's word, but we need to adapt it and change with the times because this is what people believe now. And unless you do this, people are just going to leave your church. So you better do this, or otherwise young people are going to leave. So let's get with the times and change your doctrine. That's how it impacts the church directly.
And to that point, that's Protestant liberalism. That's what they've been saying that for how long now?
400 years.
Yeah. For I was saying 300, but 400, sure. I mean, that's been the whole MO of Protestant liberalism. So it's like, it doesn't surprise me that that's still kind of floating out there.
Right. The way you say this is especially in like the 1920s, right? Well, we know science doesn't show the virgin birth, and the majority of people think that's kind of a silly story. And we know that dead men stay dead. And so because of those things, the majority of scientists, the majority of people think those are just fairy stories. Let's adapt the Bible and change the Bible. So therefore, we can just make sure we're still relevant. So it's a search for cultural relevancy at the expense of truth. It's the search for majority opinion and being relevant to people or going with the flow in order to somehow, maintain your status in society. No, our commitment is for truth and against error, regardless of what society says, regardless of what the majority think, regardless of what year it is. We are for truth and against error because that's what we've been commanded to be in both the Old and New Testaments. We are bound by the word of God, not by the whims of the culture.
So let's touch on this other version of appeal to people. So even doing the bandwagon.
Right. That's
another one that I think is very subtle, but it's called appeal to snobbery. And what this is basically there's some elite group that is thought that you want to be a part of, and to appeal to your desire to be a part of that group, you need to, do X, Y, or Z, or hold this position to be a part of that in group. That's sort of how appeal to snobbery works. So, for instance, this would be, this is like what everybody does to sell, let's say golf clubs. If you're going to be a great golfer, you need to have this golf, this is the club for the superior golfer. If only you had that golf club, you would be a superior golfer.
Right. We see that one often in advertising, right? So these sports guys drink Gatorade, or they, use Rawlings for gloves, or they, whatever it is, especially in advertisements. We see this one frequently.
Yeah. Now that's in advertising, but in terms of Christianity, if you want to be taken seriously as an intellectual, that you cannot hold complementarianism, because you are seen as an antiquated, old fart bigot, basically, and
patriarchal, what would be a white, cisgendered, patriarchal, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that's part of the hegemon. And so if you hold to those positions, you're part of the problem of this oppressive class. So often these are tied into critical theory, but you're right that's even without the critical theory part of it, right?
Yeah. If you want to be taken seriously or if you want an academic position, here are the acceptable beliefs to have an academic position. Like if you want to be considered an intellectual, you have to hold this set of beliefs.
Another great example would be accepting macroevolution in the science realm. So if you want to be the marketplace of ideas and you're a Christian, you better be a theistic evolutionist. Otherwise, people aren't going to take you seriously. They're going to think you're stupid. So you better be a theistic evolutionist if you're going to believe in God. Because if you hold to whether it's old Earth, young Earth, or 6 days or whatever, it doesn't matter. Unless you hold to the scientific consensus, you can't be taken seriously because you clearly are not intelligent. Because only intelligent people would actually. No, you're absolutely right. That's an appeal to that elitism, that appeal to that group think. So yeah, that happens all the time. This is why Christians often end up, at least faithful Christians, end up leaving academia. Is for the reason that you're referring to right now, as far as things go. And also just as theologians in the marketplace of ideas, whether it's online or tweeting or on Facebook or just making public statements, we hesitate to do so because we know that we're going to have to check all these boxes first in order to have a hearing. And it's so exhausting to try to explain all those things. So many just give up and just don't enter the marketplace at all.
Yeah. Yeah. So that snobbery, man, it's very subtle. Because if you find yourself wanting to be accepted by a group and changing your positions in order to be accepted by some group, you're probably falling prey to that fallacy. You're not, now maybe there might be reasons for you, but there better be reasons, not just, I want to be accepted by this group. If that's your reason, then that's an appeal to snobbery. But if it's I'm being persuaded because their ideas are better, well, okay then. But that's not normally what's going on.
I mean, and it's subtle, because sometimes, what authorities think do matter. It's not that it doesn't establish truth, but you should at least consider it. For example, if most doctors believe that being morbidly obese is a way to get heart disease, then that's probably matters. You should at least look at that. If your doctor tells you that and other doctors are telling you that, and they study the human heart, you would be kind of foolish to ignore all of that, right? If they're telling you that if you keep doing this and you keep eating all that processed food and you don't exercise, and you're 150 pounds overweight and all these other different things, and then they say to you, if you don't change your lifestyle, you could have a shortened life. You don't just say, well, that's just an appeal to, that's just me. If I want to be acceptable, maybe I'll do that. But that's not the sort of argument we're making. And I want to just make sure that we're clear on that, right? We're not saying that you can't trust your doctor, or that you can't trust your pastor, or that people who are experts don't matter. That's not what we're saying, right? We're not saying that. But what we're saying is there's this idea that there's these benchmarks to be in this kind of elite group. And if you don't meet those benchmarks, you therefore have nothing to say, or that your logic doesn't matter, or that you don't have an opinion, or so it's those aren't the exact same things. Do you want to kind of go off of that a little bit too?
Actually, I was going to give a resource. If I'd encourage everybody at some point to read C.S. Lewis's Inner Ring. That's really what his work Inner Ring is about, is this desire that we all have. Like, how do you deal with this desire that we all have to be in the in group? And it's actually a really thoughtful piece, and you begin to think it should be eye-opening to all of us just how much time we spend trying to get in the in group.
Right. I think that's great. And of course, this is going to be the Lutheran in me talking, but even in your tradition, you'll agree with this to a certain extent, I think, is we would say in your baptism, you've been made part of the in group.
Yeah.
So, I mean, God's already said yes. So if God said yes to you, you're the ultimate in group and the only in group that matters. And so start there. That's how you get into the in group, the group that, lasts for forever and reigns with him in eternity. God says yes to you. In his son, he says yes to you. So start there. Instead of trying to do all these other things in which you're going to almost certainly be guilty of not only a logical fallacy, but also idolatry, because you're putting your hope in something that's not found in God.
Right. Yep. I think, okay, let's do this last one. Another appeal to people is appeal to fear. So this is like, think fear mongering, some fear that a group may happen to have, and I'm going to play on this fear in order to get people to agree with me or disagree with me. So for example, I recall our mom had us watch The Music Man. And in The Music Man, he's a con artist, and he's trying to figure out, how can I con these people into buying my instruments so I can, milk them for money. And one of his ideas is like, okay, what's kind of going on now? And he hears that there's some new, like, I forget, like it's an arcade. It's not an arcade, but some kind of new youth hangout somewhere.
Right, in a hall, yeah.
Yeah, and he's like, if we let this hall go undisturbed, and if we just let this hall go, we're going to have a bunch of corrupted youth, and we don't want corrupted youth. And because we don't want corrupted youth, you should instead buy my musical instruments and avoid this place that has like a pool room and ping pong table or whatever it is.
Right.
I
think that's a great example.
Yeah, so he's playing on a common fear that we have, which is our youth, right? Our kids. We want to protect them. We want to see them non-corrupted, and so playing on that fear. So it's very basically appeal to fear is a fear mongering. I'm going to play on some sort of fear that the crowd happens to have in order to get them to adopt my position.
It happens often. It's very, very common in political discourse, and also again in marketing. We're afraid of being sick. So guess what? Especially when you get to news channels or channels that appeal to people that are over the age of 40, how often do you see medical ads about the latest and greatest treatment? With all the caveats, right? And the reason is because they're trying to sell something, because people don't want to be in pain. People don't want to be, dying early. People don't want to be uncomfortable or to suffer. And those are natural things. I'm not saying those things are good things necessarily. I'm just saying that's how they market that. So, and politicians are brilliant at this too. We fear the unknown. So we want to have everything planned out. We fear being alone. So we want to have access to the global market and the global network for 24/7. We appeal being ignorant. We hate being ignorant. So I need to have my phone on me because I need to have answers, right? So we do a lot of things based on fear. But then, like you said, we also establish truth that way. Well, we know, and that's where it becomes logically fallacious. It's an appeal to the group. A lot of people are afraid that they might get sick here. And so we need to make sure that we put in this new regulation.
Yeah.
So does that mean that's inherently moral or good because people are afraid of it? What if their fear, and this is what, of course, I know you agree with, what if the fear itself is irrational?
Yeah.
If the fear is irrational, does that mean that the solution to an irrational fear is to create more solutions? Does that mean it's good because the majority of the people want it based on fear? The answer is no. If people are irrationally afraid of something, putting in a solution to an irrational fear that is also irrational does not establish truth just because the majority of people want it. So it's I don't know why we go that route. It's really odd. I mean, other than we're human beings that are broken and fallen, which of course is the standard answer that we would give for a lot of these.
Well, and I think the other way that you could see this too, like parents want their kids to be thriving. That's a very common. We want our kids to thrive. We want them to live. And so that's where I think the common thing going on right now is, as a parent, you must affirm your child's gender decision. That's the area. Yep. I think and if you don't, then your kid's going to die. And so they literally are putting this parent in this position to where they feel like, if I don't affirm my kid's gender decision, my kid's going to die. And and it's fallacious, but I think parents are duped by that fallacy, because that's a legitimate fear that parents have, and they're playing on that in order to get for them to further that transgender agenda.
So, right. When that actually is similar to the fallacy we did earlier with the disparity argument, right? We're going to appeal. So a lot of these, and we've discussed this earlier, a lot of these fallacies often piggyback off of each other, or they're kind of cousins to each other, or they kind of compile on top of themselves. So like this one, we're talking about the appeal to this group because based on fear, but how do we get that fear? Based on our single interpretation of these disparities. See what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And so because and those are also based on these kind of Kafka-esque ideas of, well, we know this is an oppressed class. Everybody's already guilty here and they're not guilty here. So all of these things compiled, all these logical fallacies are not independent. They intermix and interweave to create a fallacious worldview. And what Carl Trueman, who I recommend highly, and I think you would too, Carl Trueman's writings, Carl Trueman would call this, and he gets this from philosophers, that what we're really dealing with here is not only an alternate worldview, but what we're really dealing with is an anti-culture. It's not a culture. The reason these are fallacious is they're used and employed to destroy something, to tear something down, to revolutionize society. It's not because they're logical or coherent or they can stand on their own. The reason they're all compounded and compiled together is because they're all tools to try to suck as many people in so that we can have the revolution and overturn society. That's the real reason we use these. Because, I mean, think for a great example of this, of how this is a little bit of a tangent, but I think you know this. We're talking, you brought the transgender issue. Nobody wants to point out that the L and the G in that acronym are completely contradictory to the T.
Yeah.
They're completely contradictory. But because they're all opposed to this oppressor, or they have the same goals of overturning society, they're co-belligerents. It's kind of the enemy, my enemy is the friend, even if they don't necessarily coexist. That's why you might see, for example, certain groups in that community rallying with, say, Palestinian liberations together in the same parade, even in spite of the fact that if they were living in the Middle East, they'd be far more oppressed, right? You get what I'm saying?
Oh, yeah.
But because they're co-belligerents, so the reason these fallacies and all these group identities come together and they're all often in the same package is it's not because they cohere or they're necessarily together. It's because you stack all these together and the goal is to overturn society. And so that's the issue. And that's why these are so popular, is there's a political goal. And the political goal is about overturning, and it's about power. The real issue is power. And because I'm in these groups, I want political power, and I want to take it from these other groups so that I can therefore have power. And so it's very fascinating to see all these go together. And so they're not supposed to cohere. You don't need to cohere. All you need to know is that there's this oppression here, and that all those fallacies, even logic itself. Here's the other part, and I think I want you to jump you in on this. How dare you, white, cisgendered, heterosexual, native-born, able-bodied white people, how dare you call these fallacies out like you just did for the last 30, 40 minutes? How dare you do that? Because in fact, that shows that logic and rationality are also tools of oppression because
White
you're
supremacy.
using them. What was that now?
Said it's white supremacy.
Right. Logic and tools and reasoning, those are a certain type of discourse. That's a certain type of reasoning. And since you're doing those things, that proves your privilege. Only people that are guilty of privilege would use logic and reasoning and rationale because that's used to keep down alternative knowledges.
Yeah.
Right. That's how this works. It's an anti-culture. It doesn't stand for anything.
Well, and which I think the next time you and I get together, I wanted to do something on objectivism and subjectivism.
Yeah,
And
I think we should.
relativism in general, deconstruction. I think those are they're all intertwined subjects because you and I, we haven't really stated this, but when we talk about fallacies, we're assuming, and you might not know this, our premise is that there is there's objective truth, including moral truth, and theological truth, and so on. Like there's objective truth that's out there, not in here. And
Correct.
What we're dealing with right now is we live in a subjectivist culture. Now, it works itself out in different ways, but subjectivism just simply means we determine our own truth for ourselves. Right. It has nothing to do with what is verifiable, but it's all about how I feel, what I think personally on the inside. That's the determiner of the truth. I determine my own reality. That's how subjectivism works. And so when we approach things from our foundation, which is objective truth, they hear us and they assume that because we're inserting objective truth, it is a tool of oppression because to them it contradicts their own constructed worldview. It has nothing for them. And you and I have had this discussion off screen before. Reality comes first and then knowledge. For them, I have my knowledge, and my knowledge of whatever it is determines my reality. And
right. Or the way the 20th century philosophers talked about it is that your existence precede your essence, right? In other words, you what you assume about yourself, what you assume about your identity happens first, and then you look at the world. That's how we, right? As opposed to the other way around, which is that the world exists and we participate in that world, and our job is to try to understand it. And so it's an exact opposite, right? And so what is it? Existence precedes essence is the way the postmodernists will say that.
That's existentialism. Yeah.
Right. And so for us, we would say essence precedes existence. We say that's exactly the opposite of how things actually are. And as far as that goes, is that Sartre? I think it's Sartre that comes up with that one.
That's Jean-Paul Sartre. Yeah.
Yeah. And so Sartre is the one who says that. And so in other words, all of these theories we're talking about with critical theories stands on the shoulders of other people.
Yeah.
And so, Jacques Derrida is another one, right, with deconstruction. So I think you're right that we need to go into these things because we are presupposing in these discussions, not only objectivity, we're also assuming philosophical realism. Yeah. And we're also assuming essence is a thing, that there's an essence like ontological realism, right? We assume these things, you and I do. Many people in society do not assume those things. And so we have to go to some of these foundations, and that'll also help us kind of get rid of some of these fallacies too. So back to you, brother, as we wrap up.
And that's kind of where I'm thinking is the reason that to be blunt, the reason, because I'm teaching logic right now. So in this, at my community college, I'm teaching logic right now. And I'll admit I have not admitted this to my students. So I don't know, they might watch this, and I'll admit sometimes I would start thinking like, I feel sorry for you guys. Like you're here trying to learn logic, but you live in a illogical time.
Right.
It's like you guys are trying to work hard. You guys are trying to learn the tools on how to put together arguments, propositions, and statements. And honestly, right now, it probably feels like you're wasting your time because nobody cares about proper reason.
No, instead what you should be doing is having them tell all their stories, and then having their stories fit into whatever the narrative is, and check out what intersectionality boxes they check, and then write their stories, and then they can tell their truths, and then we can commiserate together and listen to each other's stories, and then create new discourses and problematize the current dominant discourses. And then afterwards, write all our papers, and you can't grade them. You just have to give them all pass fails, right? As long as they do it. And then we can be done with our class. I mean, that's basically how a lot of these college classes work now. A class on logic itself would be oppressive for some, right? Yeah. So we got to go to those foundational things. I agree with you.
Yeah. So to kind of, I guess, wrap this up, I was thinking about something C.S. Lewis, and I'm probably going to butcher the quote. So somebody who wants to look it up. What's that?
It's a paraphrase.
Yeah. So this is my,
It's the message translation of C.S. Lewis.
and it kind of, he made a really good point in one of his essays that he wrote, which is like, you cannot, whenever somebody says an idea has been dispelled or an idea has been settled, ask yourselves by whom and when.
Yeah.
Yeah, because, sometimes you'll in these discourses, we're talking about things that are just sometimes our culture assumes must be true. Like, for example, police brutality against African Americans is just assumed. And it's like, okay, that's a reality. Well, who decided that? When was it decided? On what basis was it decided? And when you start asking those questions, I'm not even saying you have to think logically. Just start asking those questions. And I'll be honest. As soon as you start raising the questions, people are going to get mad because the evidence there on a lot of times you start asking questions is lacking. Honestly, it doesn't bother me when people ask me questions about what I believe and why I believe it, because I have reasons for it. So it doesn't bother me. No. I'd only get upset if I didn't have reasons.
Right. Right. I mean, that's it's not an unexamined, an examined life. What's the quote? An unexamined life is not worth living. Right.
Right.
Aristotle, has similar things about the pursuit of excellence. The other quote I was going to say that's related, it's something that C.S. Lewis, of course, admired and read, is G.K. Chesterton, is when you come across a fence, and before you take it down, first ask yourself why it's there.
Yeah.
And right now, all it is about just destroying all fences, because all fences are stopping you from being your authentic you. And so we just got to destroy all fences. And so Lewis and I there's certain authors, and we should, maybe that would be another one, maybe as an intro. Who do we read, or what sources do we use to counteract? And as we said at the beginning of this session today, is 2 Corinthians 10. When we're demolishing these strongholds, when we're taking care down these lofty opinions and taking thought every captive to Christ, or every thought captive to Christ, what resources do we use? So that might be helpful. And maybe we could even put some slides together or something, show some people on the screen and say, hey, here's some resources, here's some websites, here's some teachers that can help you kind of navigate this marketplace of ideas. It's an exciting place, but it's also a dangerous place. How can we be faithful and compassionate in that place?
Yeah. Well, I think that's a good place to end it, because I think that is our calling as Christians, to be both courageous and compassionate. And
right.
How can we, in a culture that we are in right now, in our current cultural moment, how can we be both courageous and compassionate? And I think that's our aim. I think right now we live in a very emasculated society where courage is downplayed. There's not a lot of courage going around. So, not saying that we shouldn't be compassionate as well, but I think it's going to take Christians of great courage to begin to just articulate well their beliefs, and honestly keep talking about it, even though people might yell at you or try to cancel you or whatever. Just, for lack of a better way to say it, learn how to be a duck. Just let it wash off your back.
Right. Well, and to quote the historical, right, in the confronted of evil, to proceed more boldly against it.
Yeah. All right, bro. We'll probably should leave it off there. So the next time that we get together, we'll probably be talking about objectivism, subjectivism, relativism, those ideas of
realism, all those things. Yep.
Yeah. Some of the very basics, the foundations of truth, which I didn't think I'd have to argue about, but apparently I guess nowadays we do.
Right.
So anyway, well, thanks so much for being on. And I hope whoever watches this, you hang out for the whole time, because I think it's probably been closer to an hour. So enjoy. All right, 1 second, Aaron.